Now, we go ahead, you look at question 1 and 2, and you're wondering, well, what are the blue dots, right? Well, those are the answers, right? So if you wanted to know the answers to the questions, here are the dots. I'm not really concerned about whether or not you get the answers to these questions because they're not going to use these questions again. The regents may use the topic, the idea, they may even use the document, but they're not reusing the question. So memorizing answers doesn't help, right? So they post the answers to the test for your reference. So memorizing answers is not the solution here. It's being able to read and comprehend, see what they're asking you about, and asking yourself, like, well, what do I know about this topic? So you go ahead, you read this brief document, right? You make sure you look at the source, Narragansett Chief Mian Tonomo. Um, you know, there's no date here, but I'm telling you, this is around the 1640s. This document is coming from, and you're looking at the questions, right? The situation described in this passage was caused by, and two, what course of action does the chief Mian Tonomo support? Well, here's the thing. The first question, you can pretty much answer, very easily because as you're reading it, you should realize, okay, they're talking about Englishmen and the things that, Englishmen have seized our country. Well, one thing we know is that Native Americans are always treated harshly by European settlers and later on by American settlers, right? So this right here lets you know that there's not going to be a good outcome for the Native Americans in this situation. You say, well, why do they treat them this way? Well, because they wanted their land and they didn't respect the Native American way of life, right? European way of life and ownership of land and Native American way of life and use of land are very different in their ideology, right? So when we talk about like, well, what's going to happen? Well, you can see it in this image here. This is a drawing of, unfortunately, the chief who's the source of this document, and he's dead. He ends up dead. Now, Europeans didn't kill him. He was, strangely enough, killed by another Native American tribe. But it just goes to show you that it was a very conflict-driven time because you had Europeans pushing in, and as they pushed other tribes, kind of bumped up against each other. Um, Usually, whenever you're talking about Native Americans, if you don't get like a source like this, you might get a source that talks about like Chief Joseph, right? And Chief Joseph is really about like survival and relocation and peace. So um, Chief Joseph is not doesn't pertain to this particular question, but just remember that whenever you're talking about Native Americans, it's never going to be the question is never going to fall in their favor. It's always going to be something kind of negative, unfortunately. And when you look here, right, the situation described in the passage was caused by European settlement in North America. It says English, it says Englishmen, right? That should have been the trigger words to kind of let you know, okay, we're talking about Europeans here. What course of action does Chief Miantonomo support? Well, he goes ahead in the document, right? I ask you but to resolve to act like men. All the sachems, tribal chiefs, both to the east and the west, have joined with us, and we are resolved to fall upon them at a day appointed, and therefore I come secretly you, cause you can persuade your Indians, Native Americans, to do what you will. Well, when they say resolve to fall upon them, they're not going to fall on them. They're going to attack them, right? And most likely secretly, right? This is going to be an attack. So, um, what would he? So what is he asking for? He's asking for other tribes here to step in and help to fight these settlers that are taking the land. Okay, so just remember the answer can can usually be found either directly in the document or it can be inferred based on what you're talking what they're talking to you about, right? Just keep that in mind. And also remember, if you know something to be true in history, right? You know Native Americans are always treated poorly. Just remember that and look for the answer that kind of matches up to that narrative. Questions 3 and 4 are based on this really brief quote here, right? They don't give you too much. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, right? So you say, oh gosh, what is this about? I've never heard of this, or they're not telling me much, right? They didn't tell you the source or a title or anything. So this, you're gonna have to kind of um, rely on your content knowledge. And this is actually, something that John Locke happens to bring up, right? And Locke is one of these thinkers that influences the American Revolution and the founding fathers, right? As soon as you see this term enlightenment, you start thinking about John Locke, Rousseau, Voltaire, right? These are the Enlightenment thinkers that the founding fathers, or the people that wrote the Constitution, that they were in, and the Declaration of Independence. These are the people that they were drawing from, right? So, which Enlightenment principle does this quotation refer to? Consent of the governed. How do we know it's consent of the governed? Where consent is basically permission. And here it says it is the right of people to alter or to abolish it, right? So when we listen, when we remember what John Locke taught, he basically says that um, there is no such thing as divine right. So that goes completely against like kings and queens and monarchs, right? So he's speaking up against that. But then in his second treatise on government, or second essay, right? They call it a treatise, but a treatise is just an essay. His second essay uh, talks about like, well, what is government for? And he clearly states that government is part of this thing called a social contract that people enter into, and it's out of protection, right? People need government and want government to protect themselves and to protect property. And in return, people are willing to give up a certain amount of power. And when people give up power, um, the government takes that power, but then protects the people and protects the rights of the people. Okay, so um, this is the exchange, right? The reason we have government is because we, the people, are willing to give up power to the government in return for the protection that the government provides for us. And therefore, when you talk about like what is the right of the people when you have a government that violates the social contract, well, it's the right of the people to abolish or get rid of it, right? So when you talk about what impact did this quotation have on the American Revolution, it helped to justify the colonists' fight for independence, right? They said, well, the reason we can rebel is because, you know, John Locke and the other Enlightenment thinkers gave us permission to, and here's their words to prove it. Here, um, questions 5 and 6 are really about one particular word, and that word is embargo, right? This is one of those times where either you could remember the event back from the beginning of the school year, or you can look and say, well, man, what does that word embargo mean? I don't quite remember it. So an embargo is when there's a restriction and you're not allowed to do something, you're blocking trade, right? Usually the government is doing this. The government is setting an embargo, um, and they're saying, nope, we can't have any trade, and there's usually a reason behind it. And in this case, when we talk, when they're showing you this particular um there's actually a song, right? Our ships all in motion once withered the ocean, they sailed and returned with the cargo, now doomed to decay, they are falling a prey to Jefferson, worms, and embargo. Right, you got me to sing. So you look at the source, Henry Mellon, 1808, Massachusetts Historical Society. Well, that lets you know, okay, Massachusetts, embargo. Embargo means like stopping trade, putting a restriction. If you look at the little political cartoon that stopped on the bottom right, I don't know if they use it anymore, but this is the famous embargo political cartoon, and in fact, when you see he says, how it nicks them, right? So you could see the turtle, the snapping turtle. Oh, this cursed, oh grab me. Well, oh grab me is embargo. It's reversed, right? So the turtle is being called oh grab me, but it's actually an embargo. And you see the guy's got his stuff that he wants to sell here. It says super fine, and you got the British ship, so he wants to go ahead and sell to the British ship, but he's not allowed to because we know historically during this time the British were impressing or basically kidnapping Americans and taking American ships and taking sailors for their own wars and their own issues, because the British at this time, they weren't quite satisfied with the results of the Revolutionary War, and this is going to lead to a second conflict known as the War of 1812, right? And Jefferson at the time, who's the president, he's kind of trying to avoid all of this, but it's not working out so well. So why would the people in Massachusetts particularly be upset about this embargo? It has to do with the colonies, right? So if you remember the 13 colonies, right, at this time they're no longer colonies; they're actually states. So we know that these are actually states at this time, but what these states are engaging in as far as like industry has not changed. So these particular states are still engaging in agriculture, trade, right, shipping. And so if there's an embargo, it's these states, such as Massachusetts, that's going to have a difficult time because they're not going to be allowed to sell their goods to where they want to because the president has put on them this embargo. And that's how you can kind of remember what this was all about. So if you remember, it's about impressment. It's about trying to limit the amount of American ships that are out in the ocean, because if there's no ships in the ocean, well then there's no way for the British to take these ships and sailors and kind of violate American sovereignty.